Hello everyone. Today we are talking about complex designs. And what we mean by complex designs is just designs that are including more than one independent variable, sometimes used as controls or just ways of seeing the limits or extents to our theories that we're trying to investigate, right? So how our hypotheses hold across groups maybe, across different situations. The example on the title site here is really looking at satisfaction on the y-axis, which would be our dependent variable in this case, right? And on the x-axis, we have a couple different things there, ice cream and pancakes. So that would be, let's say, type of food would be the variable. And then on the other axis there, you see we have cold and hot, and that would be another variable, let's say temperature. So it's type of food by temperature on satisfaction, right? That's how we would say that. And in this case, you can see the clear interaction between type of food and temperature of food on how much we like it. We don't like really cold pancakes or hot ice cream, right? No bueno. So that's a way of describing an interaction, even though that study wouldn't necessarily be of super psychological interest. You can understand why the variables would interact in that way on our satisfaction. So of course, in some cases we have one independent variable, and I like to stress here that this one independent variable, or causal variable, has here you see two different dependent variables, usually on the y-axis, right? So in this case it's the intensity of the shock and the duration of the shock. So sometimes, we want to look at a variety of different outcomes, but only have one really causal agent that's at play here. In this case, being drunk or not drunk, placebo group versus the alcohol group, and then how much aggression they are willing to show in those various sort of indices, dependent variable outcomes. So you see there's a difference there for duration, maybe not as much for intensity. So we can see different sorts of reactions there to the alcohol. So experiments can also have two independent variables, right? And once we go from one independent variable, like drunk or not drunk, to multiple independent variables, we can look at those sort of nuances, right? So there's different types that we'll go through. These intuitive interactions are sort of just ways you think it would work, right? Expected interactions or hypothesized interactions, right? But there's what we call factorial designs, and that's when we say, IV1 at level 2 of IV2, right? So we're talking about different sort of mixes and matches of when the IVs are present. We can explore those factorials through these multiple independent variables, minimum of 2, but you can have factorials with 3 independent variables, 4 independent variables, almost as many as you can come up with. And they're used for various things, to test limits of theories, like I mentioned earlier, so maybe when this doesn't apply, can test theories and where they hold and don't hold, and also, sort of get at the not just the interactions, but the main effects, right? So what we usually think of as main effects, the effect of just alcohol, let's say. But if we look at alcohol and, let's say, IV number 2 gender on intensity of shock, we may understand that relationship a little bit better. So those first ones I talked about, intuitive, there's a couple of different types illustrated there, the crossover and spreading interactions. And these are, let's say, hypothesized interactions between food type and food temperature, or in the other case, it's speaking, so saying sit versus saying nothing on, let's say, dog training, right? And so you see that there's sort of the impact of the treat there, and we can see impact with verbal command on the outcome. On the right there, the spreading interaction is just depicted in two different ways, but it's basically showing the same information, which is interesting. Showing the either decline in proportion of sits or the increase in proportion of sits, depending on whether the treat is there. So these factorial designs that I mentioned, these are sort of the intermix of all the independent variables that you might have in your study, right? So in this case, we're looking at cell phone and not on cell phone. So that's 2 levels of the phone IV. So if you see the 2 by 2 there, that's 2 levels. And then young drivers versus old drivers, that's 2 levels of your second IV. So you end up having 4 conditions there, potentially. And if this is a completely between subjects design, you have different people in each one of those conditions, right? So you have, let's say, 10 young drivers on the cell phone that you observe or study, 10 younger drivers not, 10 older, and 10 older not on the cell phone, right? So you have 40 total, let's say. When we talk about within subject designs, those would all be the same people, with which age you can't do, right? So in this case, you might want to have a mixed design, we call it, with this factorial, where you have, let's say, not on phone and on phone being a within subject variable. So younger drivers and older drivers, it's hard to say, would be studied on and off the phone. So the age of the driver would be the between subjects, and the phone would be the within subjects. Anyways, that's a little added explanation there, but really we use these factorials to study all sorts of extra variables such as age, to see maybe where these theories hold and where they don't hold, that we'll talk about in a second, and for who and whom they do not, right? So that's what we kind of mean sometimes by testing limits, right? So in this case, does the cell phone affect the drivers? In this case, it didn't seem to be significantly sort of an interaction, and you see there the sort of means in the boxes and the lines describing those means, the cell means. And you see, even though in this case older drivers were, slightly slower on the brake and slightly slower when on the phone, the pattern held the same for younger and older, right? So even though they were slightly different, you see the lines are different. So that's a sort of a main effect of being on the phone or being younger, but there's no interaction between being on the phone and being younger. Then, as we said before, the lines would spread apart or cross over or something like that. And of course, we test the numbers, but we can see it as well with those lines. So this also provides us ways of looking at generalizability, or what we call external validity, right? So it's asking then, is the effect the same, or does it hold for older drivers, right? And that's what we mean by sort of the external validity. Does this effect we see in the lab of cell phones on driving generalize to, in this case, older drivers, right? Or does it in some way interact with age, right? That's what moderators are. Mediators are different, remember. That's where the process goes through a variable, creates some change in the mediator, which then results in the change in the dependent variable. Moderators are just where IVs interact in a way where you see that crossover or spread. And you see a slightly more realistic spread and crossover sort of interaction there. They're usually more subtle like that, and that's why the statistics are important, to see if that sort of spread of the lines or crossover of the lines is significant enough to say that there is an interaction between age and driving based on cell phone use, let's say. The alcohol take there is the shock intensity example. So the weight of the participant is 1 IV, the drunk or not drunk, borracho, non-borracho, on shock intensity there, just that single outcome in that case. So 2 IVs and 1 DV there. Anyways, I also mentioned main effects, and what those are is sort of like just the overall effect of age or alcohol, not looking at those specific sorts of levels based on the other IV, right? So just the effect of alcohol on aggression, not looking at age, not looking at weight, nothing like that. And of course, if you looked at that, you would probably see that alcohol does have some general main effect on aggression. Then when you get into the gender or weight or whatever, you might see even more dramatic effects for certain types of people. And that's what we get at with interactions, right? We say sometimes it's a difference in differences. There are differences between these differences for different types of people, right? And in many cases, this is more important, right? More nuanced, more explanatory power, if you will, than just a typical main effect, because it's saying for who or for when this is most dramatic. We also sort of breezed by the fact that you can have 2 IVs, 3 IVs, and I mentioned briefly the levels within those IVs. So in a 2x2, we have, let's say, temperature of food, hot, cold, on type of food, pancake, let's say, or ice cream. But you can also have something called a 2x2x2, which would be, let's say, temperature of food, type of food, and then maybe gender of participant or sex, right? So male or female. So that would be a 2x2x2. You can also add levels of variables, of course. So we could have had a cold room temperature and hot food temperature condition, as well as type of food and then gender. That would be a 3x2x2, because we have 3 levels of that temperature condition. So that would be 3x2x2 if you had hot, cold, and room temperature, as well as type of food and gender of participant. So we look for these sort of main effects as overall differences in these IVs. So is there an effect of aggression? Is there an effect of alcohol? That sort of stuff. And when you see those sort of marginal means on the outsides of those tables there being very different, you expect to see some significant result when you do the statistics. So see on the right there, the aggressive or neutral word type did not seem to have a difference there. 555 versus 557. In that time on reaction time or whatever, where at the bottom right, when you look at those marginal means for drinking, sort of placebo versus drunk, on the shock intensity, you see there 4.91 versus 6.60. Those means are obviously different. In that case, we see that the drunk group did a higher shock intensity on the 1 to 10 scale versus the placebo group. So 4.91 for placebo, 6.60 for the drinking drunk group. So then you could probably say that main effect is going to be significant, and there is a main effect of drinking on shock intensity. Then you go to the other sorts of, more subtle effects or interactions. So again, it's a difference in difference. And you can see these in a variety of different ways. Here's some more examples that are described in your textbook for you related to different interactions. And in this case, showing interactions on the left versus the lack of an interaction, but maybe the presence of main effects on the right. You can also describe this, of course, in words, not just pictures. So if you're looking at the sort of chess piece example on the number of items recalled for child and adult sort of chess players, you'd say something like, child chess experts can remember more chess pieces than digits, but adult chess novices can remember more digits than chess pieces. That's that crossover interaction. So it's kind of performing the opposite for these different groups, right? And this other one's a little bit more of a spreading example. You'd say that the drunk group was more aggressive than placebo group, especially for the heavier men. Because you see the heavier men are rising at a more dramatic rate, that green line, for the shock intensity, right? So those sorts of explanations would be more so in the results or discussion section. You would predict this in a slightly different way. You'd maybe say that a main effect for chess pieces, then a main effect of maybe type of word or whatever. I mean, adult versus child, and then chess piece versus digit. You might have a main effect prediction for each of those, and then an interaction prediction where you'd say something like, it is predicted that adult individuals will remember this type versus children will remember this type. And then you test that through the methodology and speak to it more like this, that they could remember more usually in the outcome. But anyways. So we say that interactions are also more important because they're showing usually a slightly more detailed picture, right? So when they're showing both main effects and interactions, typically they're focused, that third hypothesis or that major focus is on the interaction itself, right? There's some group or difference in groups or difference in situations that's particularly important to these researchers, right? Anyways. Here's some also possible main effects and interactions depicted here with a little bit of a description, which I think is useful and hopefully indicative of some of the maybe hypotheses you might have that may have different reactions for different people, depending on your multiple IVs. We have a lab assignment that does this, making you look at your different independent variables and seeing how they would relate to each other. So it may be something like that classic crossover, but it may be something where you're just expecting really more main effects, like you see in that second one. So you'll want to sort of look at these in relationship maybe to the variables that you're investigating in your study and see which of these best mimics that sort of IV, DV, and maybe multiple IV prediction. If you only really have one IV, then maybe consider throwing in an extra DV or two, like the very first example where we're looking at one IV and then multiple DVs, in that case shock intensity and shock duration. And finally, some more of these, different types of interactions and possible no interactions. Like that second one has no main effects and no interactions because you can barely see it, but the two lines are basically overlapping. Let's hope that doesn't happen. So we also have some variations on factorials, right? So we talked about independent versus within for a second. What that basically implies is that you have people experiencing, again, one level of the independent variable or potentially multiple levels of that independent variable. So it's a unique experiences versus they get all of the different levels. So they would get both types of word choices, let's say, If you have something like age, of course they cannot experience both age groups, unless you have some very sophisticated, very longitudinal design, right? Anyways, we have mixed factorials when it's representing both of those, right? So you have maybe one independent variable like age, where you only get one level, and the other variable maybe as a type of food or whatever, cell phone or no cell phone, that you could experience both potentially. They could study you while you're on a cell phone and when you're not on a cell phone. So this is sort of sophisticated in a sense because you can use less people in many examples. Anyways, so we can increase the number of levels of an independent variable as well as the number of independent variables. I described this with the 2x2 versus the 3x2. You can have 2 levels of each independent variable, let's say hot or cold and young or old, but you can also have the 3 levels of the independent variable, let's say hot, medium temperature, and cold. So that's increasing the levels of the independent variable. Adding an independent variable or adding numbers of independent variables is when you add something like age or temperature or type of food. Those are all variables. So if you increase another one of those, you're increasing multiple cells and potentially needing more people as well, but that independent variable might have explanatory power you want to investigate. So again, independent groups, both IVs are independent. That's completely independent because everybody's getting a unique experience, right? So a 2x2 independent groups factorial design has 4 groups or 4 different experiences, right? Each of those experiences having unique participants, right? So nobody's getting the multiple levels of any of the IVs. So this is between subjects or independent groups. Within groups is highly advantageous because you see here if they're experiencing the different levels, right? Alcohol, no alcohol, neutral, aggression-related words. Those same 12 people can participate in each one of those combinations of experiences. But if you only want them to see, let's say, a photo related to a plant and only see neutral words as primes or whatever, then you would need 48 people, right? Because you would need 12 people in each of those cells, we call it, or experiences or conditions. So in the last one, you see it's mixed because some people get multiple levels of the IV and some people only get one level of the IV, right? So the 1 through 12 there, all those people are experiencing, I think, the alcohol and the with the neutral words and the alcohol with the aggression-related words, right? And then the 13 through 24 are getting only the plant with the neutral words and the aggression-related words, right? So anyway, it sort of splits the difference there. If you can do within, it's more powerful, right, statistically, because people are acting as their own control, though, and you need less of them. So with a mixed factorial, that last type, you have one IV manipulated, let's say as an independent groups where each person is getting a unique experience, and the other one is within groups where they're getting a repeated experience. So, every level of that independent variable. So it's sort of the middle ground, like I said. You need about middle amount of people, and you have about a medium amount of power. So we went through this a little bit, but remember increasing the levels is different than increasing the variables. Increasing levels is the minutia or the detail with a variable. Increasing variables is adding variables or adding new independent variables that could be causal mechanisms, right? So instead of just temperature, also type of food, right? And that's where those interactions really come in. So if you're increasing the number of the independent variables, you may have a main effect from some sort of interaction, as well as a interaction between the two variables and any extra variables that you might have. So the important point here is that if you keep adding variables, you keep having distinctions that may or may not be important, right? Or interactions that may or may not be important. You have to have theory to support those. And the more interactions you sort of investigate, the less power you have. You're getting less power with each sort of split up of that data, unless it's truly all within subjects. But if it's between subjects, you're getting less and less people represented in each cell, and so your power kind of goes down. But in some cases, at least a three-way interaction, like described here, where you have light versus heavy traffic, so that's 2 levels of one IV. You have hands-free versus no cell phone, so that's 2 levels of a second IV. And then you have young versus old drivers, which is 2 levels of that third IV, right? So that third one, of course, is going to be independent groups at the least, right? They can't experience both. But the other two, maybe you could do within subjects and have this sort of as a mixed design, but have 3 major independent variables that you're looking at there. And of course, the interactions that follow. Because the major question maybe is just how younger versus older people handle traffic while on the cell phone, right? So why worry? Well, it's mostly related to theory, right? So the interactions can really test those theories in the most sophisticated way, right? So interactions are all around you. You can think about all sorts of interactions you hear about or see, such as different sorts of effects of alcohol on people, like we described earlier, heavier versus younger people. Also, of course, gender on, let's say, something like perceptions of media, right? Let's say different types of ads can be valenced in certain ways, happy, sad, maybe depict sort of different body types, and different genders may have different reactions on that, right? So the genders in that case might be like a moderator or sort of a change agent in how those advertisements or alcohol affects you, right? So the idea there is that a sophisticated hypothesis will follow from that, right? That we can ask a very detailed question. So think about these variables within your study, see what sorts of interactions you might be predicting there, and I would say take your variables and look at these different graphs and see, based on the overall sort of main effect hypotheses you have, how these independent variables might interact with each other and create those unique patterns that we might see, the spreading versus the crossover, or other sorts of things. In some cases, you may not predict interactions, and that's fine too. You can just have main effects for each of your independent variables on some dependent variable of interest. If you only have one independent variable, though, I would say look to those dependent variables and see if there's similar variables that might be impacted by that variable, and you can include multiple dependent variables to show all the effects that that IV might have, as long as you offer a hypothesis for each one of those main effects that you predict.